It was a perfect day. Too perfect, in fact. The kind of day when secrets have nowhere to hide. But in the quiet corners of St. Mary Me, a storm was brewing, one that would shatter lives and change everything we thought we knew. A simple tea party was all it took for a life to end, for a plan to go wrong, and for someone to pay the ultimate price. And the most chilling part, it was all hidden in plain sight. Let's see if you can figure out who was pulling the strings before the truth comes crashing down. Miss Marple firmly believed that gardens often revealed secrets of human nature that escaped ordinary notice. Even that morning, as the soft dewdrops shimmered like pearls on the rose petals, she was snipping a withered bloom with her sharp shears, every movement reflecting a quiet precision and years of practiced experience. In the distance, birds seemed to be singing songs of invisible secrets, their shrill notes carrying an uneasy undercurrent. It was then that Florence, her loyal housekeeper for many years, appeared at the side gate of the garden, holding a newspaper in one hand, and wearing a smile that conveyed everything without uttering a single word. "Madam, Mrs. Lavinia Fitton is hosting another garden party," she announced, extending the paper towards her. Miss Marple accepted it with a slight knowing smile, and adjusted a silvery strand of hair beneath her straw hat, as if preparing herself to face an approaching storm. "How delightful," she murmured with a hint of amusement. "Another garden, cucumber sandwiches and hidden hostilities." Florence chuckled. "Whether it's tea or trouble, she has a way of bringing it to a boil." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, a glint deepening in her eyes. "And what one learns at such gatherings is often far from what one expects." Nethercompton Village had become far too peaceful lately, so much so that Miss Marple's instincts grew restless. Experience had taught her that when waters appeared still, it often meant there was something dark and dangerous lurking beneath. Gardens bloom every year, but never without thorns, and Miss Marple knew that sooner or later, the thorns would prick. While mulling over these thoughts, an envelope arrived, heavy with the sweet scent of lavender, but carrying underneath a faint rotting smell, sealed with a monogram de Flive. She carefully opened it with her silver letter opener. "Tea at 2, she read aloud softly, a shadow of suspicion flickering in her eyes. Mrs. Fitton's parties were seldom purely for amusement. She had a knack for sowing poisonous seeds during the village's small social gatherings, seeds that quickly blossomed into full-blown chaos. In Nethercompton, behind every invitation to mingle, there was always an underlying agenda, whether to forge new friendships, investigate old rivalries, or quietly launch a new feud, all concealed beneath sparkling tablecloths and sweet lemon cakes. "She never invites without a reason," Miss Marple said with a smile, when Florence asked if she would attend. "Of course," she replied, a twinkle in her eye that only those familiar with the dark corners of human nature would recognize. When the day of the party arrived, the garden looked like a dreamscape. Each peony stood proudly like young soldiers in a line. Silver trays gleamed under the sun, and glasses of sparkling ginger cordial danced in the light. Miss Marple arrived precisely on time, greeting old faces with warm smiles and a quietly observant gaze, much like a monarch surveying her subjects. There was Edmund Fullerton, Lavinia's stepson, a restless man whose nervous tapping fingers and dark shadows under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights and heavy burdens. By the peonies stood Vera Calthorpe, once Lavinia's confidant, now clutching her teacup with a brittle smile, as if concealing a hidden conspiracy. Dr. Howard Green, the village doctor, loitered near the table, smiling too much and mopping his brow, as though haunted by some unspoken fear. Beatrice Langley, an old friend of Lavinia's, with a large hat and a face marked by uncertain loyalties and secrets barely suppressed. And lastly, Reverend Phelps, who, though looking respectable and innocent, cast furtive glances at Lavinia every time she laughed too loudly, as if he wanted to say something but found no words. Each guest carried their own secrets, weaving unseen games among the splendor of the garden. Lavinia herself had become the grand actress on this stage, wrapped in mauve silk, wearing a snake-shaped amethyst brooch around her throat like a warning. Raising her glass, she poised to announce the beginning of an unseen storm. "I thank you all for coming," she said in a lilting tone, "and I hope you are enjoying the tea, though for some it might be a little harder to swallow." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the group as Lavinia dropped her bombshell. "I am making changes to my will. I have discovered new shades of loyalty over the past year." Miss Marple quietly observed the shifting glances and suppressed reactions. Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Vera paled visibly. Dr. Green dropped his biscuit onto his plate. And with a deceptively sweet smile, Lavinia let the venom slip. "Not everyone will receive what they expect. And secrets, my dears, never stay buried, especially when the need to hide them is greatest." An eerie stillness fell over the garden, as if beneath the heady scent of blooming flowers, some festering truth was waiting, just moments away from breaking free. The conversation suddenly stalled, and an eerie stillness descended upon the guests, as though a storm was waiting to break. Miss Cartwright took a delicate sip of her tea, her eyes flicking across each face, searching for something hidden. Rosalind had just slipped the revolver back under the table, but the question lingered: who would pull the trigger? It happened so swiftly that later no one could agree on the exact moment of the fatal act. In one instant, Rosalind had leaned forward for a second slice of cake, then in the blink of an eye, her body jerked violently. Her teacup slipped from her hand and shattered against the stone path, a sharp sound that echoed like glass breaking in a cathedral. She clutched her throat, her wide eyes filled with terror, as though she had seen something unspeakable. My chest," she gasped, staggering backward, her mauve dress swaying as if caught by some invisible wind. Then, in a final, graceful collapse, she fell to the lawn, as though bowing to an unseen audience. For a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. The only sound was the chirping of a robin from the hedge, blissfully unaware of the tragedy unfolding below. Dr. Miles was the first to act. He rushed forward, kneeling beside Rosalind, and checking for a pulse, his face paling with disbelief. "She's gone," he said flatly, his voice empty of emotion. "Dead." A wave of gasps rippled through the guests. Lady Primrose's teacup slipped from her trembling hand, and Colonel Fletcher turned away, his face unreadable beneath his hat. But Miss Cartwright didn't gasp or panic. She merely placed her cup down on the table, her expression calm and thoughtful. "Poor Rosalind," she murmured softly. "So much bitterness, and none of it ever digested." As the guests huddled in stunned silence, and Inspector Hale was summoned from the village, Miss Cartwright stood apart from the chaos, her pale blue eyes scanning the scene with sharp precision. It wasn't the dramatic fall or the fear in Rosalind's eyes that had caught her attention, but something much smaller, easily overlooked, an insignificant moment just before the tragedy. Lady Primrose, just as the tea was being poured, had dropped her teaspoon onto the grass. A slight gasp, an apology barely above a whisper. She had bent to retrieve it, but instead had reached toward the tray, and taken another, a simple motion. Miss Cartwright recalled it now with startling clarity. A small practiced movement, something most would dismiss as an accident, but not Miss Cartwright. She also remembered the fleeting flicker in Lady Primrose's expression, a brief moment that seemed calculated, not accidental. Of course, it could mean nothing, a simple mistake, a common gesture, but in Miss Cartwright's experience, it was never the grand declarations that told the story. It was the small actions, the quiet decisions, the teaspoons. Somewhere beneath the roses, the gossip, and the cake, Rosalind's tale had already begun to bloom. Inspector Hale arrived with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen too many deaths, and far too few explanations. His mustache twitched as he took in the scene. The garden, once serene, now tainted by the violence of death. The overturned teacups, the broken parasol, and the lifeless body of Rosalind, all disrupting the otherwise peaceful afternoon. Cyanide, he muttered after a quick examination of the shattered cup, and the faint, bitter scent clinging to the shards. Classic. Unmistakable. He paused. We'll need to confirm it at the lab, but there's no mistaking that smell. He turned to the gathered guests, now sitting in rigid silence, their faces pale and tight. No one is to leave the premises, he announced. This is now a criminal inquiry. Miss Cartwright remained slightly apart, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching the inspector with a detached curiosity, as though she were observing a child learning to solve a puzzle. Inspector Hale began his questioning with the maid, Mrs. Jarvis, before moving on to Rosalind's husband, Edward, whose flushed face and restless foot-tapping betrayed more than simple grief. Miss Cartwright, silent and unassuming, took her seat once more, her own cup of tea in hand, her mind already piecing together the puzzle with quiet precision. As the inspector methodically moved from guest to guest, his questions sharp and precise, Miss Cartwright took a different approach. Her style was softer, more measured, yet equally calculated. She began with Mrs. Rudge, offering a pristine linen handkerchief, her voice a calm balm to the trembling maid. It's always the hardest when one has given so much for so long, she murmured, her tone gentle but not without purpose. You must have known Mrs. Fletton better than most. Mrs. Rudge's voice cracked, and a sniffle escaped her lips. She was particular. Miss Cartwright, she replied, voice fragile, set in her ways, yes, but generous in her own way. Miss Cartwright nodded, her eyes warm but distant, a glimmer of something calculating hidden beneath her surface of sympathy. And the tea, did she prepare it herself? She inquired, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Rudge's face. No, miss. I laid out the tray, but the guests served themselves. Mrs. Rudge answered, her voice faltering with the slightest hint of guilt. She liked it that way. Miss Cartwright's gaze flickered to the table, noting the small details, the silver-plated spoons, polished just before the guests arrived. Her fingers brushed over the edge of the handkerchief, before she smiled softly at Mrs. Rudge. Thank you, dear, she said, her words soft but carrying weight. She drifted toward Reverend Phelps next, her voice a quiet hum as she offered condolences, her mind already turning over the details, her thoughts far from the simple pleasantries she shared. The Reverend's face remained impassive, though Miss Cartwright noticed the slight twitch in his jaw whenever she spoke of his most recent sermon. She didn't press, but she filed the observation away. Next, Dr. Green, his face pale, and his eyes lingering a bit too long on Vera. Thank you for your efforts, she murmured to him, offering the most delicate of smiles, her gaze steady but not unkind. She noticed, however, how his eyes seemed unwilling to leave Vera's, the fleeting tenderness in his look, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Yet Miss Cartwright remained serene, her thoughts focused elsewhere. The truth, she knew, often hid behind the most subtle of signs, not the grand displays of emotion. Edmund Fullerton, standing apart, exhaled a cloud of cigarette smoke, his posture too stiff, too controlled, as though he were fighting some great internal storm. Inspector Cray, as expected, moved toward him with directness. You argued with your stepmother yesterday, Mr. Fullerton, Cray began, his words precise, his eyes sharp. Edmund took a slow drag from his cigarette, his face a portrait of reluctant confession. Yes, she told me. She was cutting me out of the will, he muttered, bitterness lining his voice. She didn't approve of my lifestyle, mostly the debts. He let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his brow. But I loved her. She raised me, despite everything. Miss Cartwright, ever observant, watched Edmund closely, her gaze narrowing as he avoided eye contact. His hands, clenched into tight fists, spoke volumes. But so did his words. He had a motive, certainly, and he had the opportunity. But Miss Cartwright was not fooled. Poison required more than just opportunity and anger. It demanded precision, patience, and the quiet nerve to go through with it. Edmund, rash and impulsive, lacked that. No, this wasn't his doing. The crime was colder, more calculated, a touch more deliberate. Miss Cartwright made a note, her mind ticking off possibilities, her instincts telling her there was someone else here who fit the bill. Vera Calthorpe, on the other hand, was an enigma. She sat stiffly on a bench near the rose arbor, her gaze fixed on the spot where Lavinia had fallen. Her posture was controlled, too controlled, as if she were bracing herself against an inevitable storm. Miss Cartwright approached quietly, her voice a soft murmur. "May I sit with you, my dear?" Vera nodded once, a single tight movement. "I'm so sorry," Miss Cartwright said gently. "This must be terribly hard for you. You were once very close, weren't you?" Vera's lips tightened as her eyes remained fixed on the grass. "We were," she replied, her voice tight with something Miss Cartwright couldn't quite place. "I cared for her when she was recovering from her fall. But after that, we drifted apart." "I see," Miss Cartwright replied, her voice soft, but her eyes never leaving Vera's face. "And you left her service rather suddenly, didn't you?" Vera's gaze flickered, betraying a hint of unease before she quickly regained control. "It wasn't as simple as that," she murmured, her eyes glancing down at her gloves. Miss Cartwright let the silence linger, allowing Vera to fill the space with her own words. "She changed," Vera whispered finally, her voice barely above a breath. "After the accident, she became suspicious. Accused me of things." Vera swallowed, the words catching in her throat. "I thought it best to leave." Miss Cartwright offered a soft smile, not pressing further. "Of course," she said, her voice understanding. "These things are rarely simple." She paused, letting the silence hang between them. Vera looked away, her hands fidgeting with the stitching on her gloves, a sure sign of a mind in turmoil. But Miss Cartwright knew that beneath the composed exterior, Vera's guilt, or perhaps her fear, was a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap. There was more here than met the eye, and Miss Cartwright had already begun to piece the puzzle together. It was all too clear. Motives hidden in plain sight, careful misdirections, and a web of secrets, all waiting to be untangled. This was no accident, no sudden death. It was something far darker, something deliberate, and Miss Cartwright would uncover it, piece by piece. Miss Marple observed the subtle unease in the air as she drifted through the garden, her movements measured and deliberate. The guests were still scattered around, each ensnared in their own thoughts, their faces betraying little more than polite concern. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. She began with Mrs. Rudge, whose hands were trembling as she folded and refolded a linen handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously around. "You must have known Mrs. Fullerton quite well," Miss Marple said gently, her voice the perfect balance of empathy and curiosity. Mrs. Rudge sniffed and nodded, eyes glistening with something more than grief. "She could be particular," she said, her voice cracking, but generous in her own way, always set in her ways. Miss Marple watched her closely, not missing the way her words seemed to hang in the air. "And today's tea, did she prepare it herself?" Mrs. Rudge blinked, seeming to hesitate for a moment before answering, her voice tight. "No, miss. I laid out the tray, but they served themselves. She liked it that way. And the spoons, silver-plated, part of the good set, polished just before the gathering." Miss Marple's smile was serene as she patted Mrs. Rudge's hand lightly. "Thank you, dear." As the maid hurried off, Miss Marple's mind whirred, each detail snapping into place, though she remained outwardly calm. Her eyes moved next to Reverend Phelps, standing with his arms crossed tightly against his chest, the weight of something unspoken in his posture. She approached him with gentle grace, murmuring her condolences before asking softly, "Your last sermon, Reverend, was it well received?" He stiffened slightly before replying, his voice clipped. "It was well enough." His gaze, however, drifted. No, not toward the congregation, but somewhere distant, lost in thought. "And Dr. Green?" Miss Marple inquired, her eyes flicking to where the doctor stood, his jaw set. a tight smile on his lips. He was staring at Vera, though his expression was too controlled, too measured. He did all he could, of course, Miss Marple said, though she saw the lie in the doctor's eyes, the flicker of something else, not fear, but perhaps something darker, something closer to guilt. His effort had been more of an end than a rescue, she suspected, and his steely calm might be an act. She let the conversation drift, her attention never wavering, as she caught a glimpse of Edmund Fullerton standing under a lilac tree, his posture rigid as he smoked, trying too hard to appear calm. Miss Marple's instincts flared. This young man was nervous. Yes, but not guilty. No, he was too impulsive, too rash for something as calculated as murder. And yet she couldn't dismiss the potential entirely. He'd argued with his stepmother the day before, over money and an impending will change. But there was more to it than that, something deeper that still eluded her. As she watched him, her mind turned to Vera Calthorpe, who had taken refuge near the rose arbor, her face a mask of composure. "May I join you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked softly. Vera nodded, her eyes still fixed on the place where Lavinia had fallen. "You must be terribly shaken," Miss Marple continued, her voice a soothing balm. "You were once quite close, weren't you?" Vera's lips thinned. "We were," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but she changed after the fall, became suspicious. I thought it best to leave." Miss Marple nodded, sensing the layers of unspoken words. "And yet you came today out of obligation," she mused, her tone one of understanding. Vera's gaze shifted briefly before she spoke again, her voice cracking. "She invited me. I couldn't refuse." Miss Marple paused, letting the words settle in the space between them. Her instincts told her there was more, but Vera's grief felt genuine, too genuine to ignore, though Miss Marple noted the subtle fear behind it. She turned her attention once again to Dr. Green, whose discomfort seemed to grow as the questions from Inspector Cray continued. The doctor's hands were steady, but his breathing, there was something about the way he exhaled, like a man who had been holding his breath for too long. "Cyanide acts quickly, doesn't it?" Miss Marple said, her voice calm. He nodded too quickly. Nothing could have been done. His reply was almost mechanical. Still she watched him closely, wondering if his expression could be more revealing than his words. His demeanor, cold as it was, did not belong to a man who had just witnessed a death. There was something more, something he'd been carrying far longer than today. And then there was Beatrice Langley, distant, poised and hidden beneath layers of self-containment. When Miss Marple approached her, the older woman didn't greet her with warmth. "I suppose you'll ask me if I killed her," Beatrice said, her voice sharp, defensive. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "No, my dear. I have no right to ask such things. I only wondered how long you and Mrs. Fullerton had known each other." The question was simple enough, but Beatrice stiffened. "Since Calcutta," she said with a tight smile, her tone clipped. 1923. Lavinia was newly married, and I was recovering from an arrangement of my own. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Ah, the colonies. Full of such arrangements, I imagine." Beatrice's voice tightened as she continued, her eyes flashing. Lavinia had no qualms about mentioning them at the worst times. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, noting the subtle hint of fear. Fear, not guilt, in the woman's eyes. Fear of exposure, of secrets unraveling. "That can make friendships delicate," Miss Marple observed. Beatrice looked away, her lips thin. "We weren't friends. We were bound by memory, not affection," she said curtly. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her gaze steady. "Before her death, she said something provocative to you, didn't she?" The words hung in the air. Beatrice's eyes narrowed, the tension in her posture telling a story Miss Marple could only half read. "Lavinia liked to hold secrets over people," she said quietly. And there it was, the clue that would turn the investigation. As Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, the fragments of truth began to piece together, one by one. The guests' subtle movements, their secretive glances, and their uneasy breaths all whispered of a deeper story. One Miss Marple would soon uncover, but for now she lingered in the shadows of the garden, her thoughts as sharp as ever, waiting for the moment when everything would fall into place. The morning after the tragic incident, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the well-tended garden, Miss Marple stood by the garden gate, her sharp eyes taking in the details, with a calm that belied the storm of thoughts raging inside her. The scene before her, though serene on the surface, was far from peaceful. The neatly arranged teacups, which had been hastily reordered after the earlier spill, now seemed like a metaphor for the careful deceptions woven into the fabric of the day. It wasn't just the cups, of course. It was the subtle shifts in behavior, the tension hanging in the air, and the whispered exchanges among the guests. The events of yesterday had not yet settled, and already, Miss Marple could sense the cracks in the seemingly composed veneer of each individual. Her mind, ever keen to unravel the mystery at hand, was piecing together the fragments, carefully considering the moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The spilled tea, the replacement of the spoon, how easily they had been dismissed as mere accidents. Yet now, they seemed like deliberate moves in a game she had only just begun to understand. She frowned slightly, her gaze shifting back to the teacups. The incident, so easily brushed off at the time, had begun to bother her. What if the mix-up hadn't been a mistake at all? What if, in the confusion, someone had deliberately ensured that Lavinia received the poisoned cup? Or, conversely, had the confusion been enough to sabotage the murderer's plans entirely? She found herself fixated on one detail: the spoon that Vera had dropped. The simple action had seemed so trivial, so forgettable in the flurry of the moment, but now it seemed like a clue she couldn't ignore. Had that spoon, rather than the tea, been the object of tampering? She jotted down a quick note in her small notebook, which she kept carefully hidden in her handbag. Her mind was already racing, turning over the possibilities. Poisons, she knew, were a game of precision. If the confusion had been intentional, then the crime could either have been terribly reckless, or incredibly clever, and Miss Marple had long learned that cleverness often came with a heavy price. The morning progressed slowly, the bustle of the household continuing, despite the heavy air of suspicion that had settled in the wake of Lavinia's death. Inside the house, Mrs. Drudge, flustered and clearly out of her depth, had discovered Edmund Ferreton, his face pale, and his hands trembling, rifling through Lavinia's personal effects in the study. He had been caught, quite literally, with his hand in the proverbial cookie jar. A crumpled piece of paper, torn, faded and nearly unreadable, was clutched in his hand. Mrs. Drudge, scandalized, had immediately raised an alarm. "You've no right, sir," she cried, her voice quivering with indignation. "The police haven't even cleared her things yet." Edmund, trying to appear calm, had stiffened and straightened up slowly. "I was looking for something personal," he muttered, but there was a hollow, desperate quality to his tone. The words didn't carry the weight of truth. Moments later, Inspector Cray arrived, demanding an explanation. Edmund, cornered, unfolded the crumpled paper, revealing a tattered will, a will dated 6 months ago. "She changed it last week," Edmund had confessed bitterly, the resentment clear in his voice. "She told me so herself." The bitterness in his words, coupled with the stark revelation that Lavinia had been planning to leave everything to a charity for retired governesses, painted a picture of a woman who had become both vengeful and calculating in her later years. It was clear that she had not been easy to live with, but was this enough to drive Edmund to murder? As Miss Marple watched him, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. Panic, she knew, could cloud judgment, but Edmund's sense of entitlement, his desperation, all pointed towards something darker. Desperation, after all, was a powerful motivator, but was it enough to drive someone to kill? Miss Marple would need to dig deeper into the complex web of relationships and motives to find the truth. Later that afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Inspector Cray made an unannounced visit to Dr. Green's surgery. He conducted a thorough search, turning up several medical records and a dusty shelf of pharmacopoeia that seemed to have been left undisturbed for years. But it was the small vial of potassium cyanide that truly caught Cray's attention. It was locked away in a high cabinet, but the presence of such a dangerous substance in a respectable doctor's office raised immediate questions. Dr. Green, ever calm, handed over the key to the cabinet without hesitation. "We keep it for laboratory testing and rare compounds," he explained smoothly, though the words seemed rehearsed. "It's all recorded, and the cabinet is never left open." Still, Cray wasn't convinced. "But you had access," he pressed. Dr. Green's response was cool, almost dismissive. "Of course I did," he said, his smile tight and controlled. "But that hardly makes me a murderer." Miss Marple, having joined the conversation quietly, sipped her tea with deliberate slowness. "Most poisoners," she remarked, her voice soft but sharp, "are quite practical. They rarely conjure their tools from thin air." Dr. Green's smile sharpened for just a moment, and he tilted his head slightly. "Well, I assure you, Miss Marple, if I had decided to kill Lavinia Ferretin, I wouldn't have done it in full view of half the village." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with thought. "Quite," she said. But her mind was already turning over the possibilities. The presence of cyanide in Dr. Green's office was no proof of guilt, of course, but it did suggest that access to poison was not as uncommon as some might think. And poisoners, Miss Marple knew, often had legitimate reasons for being near dangerous things. As the investigation stretched on, whispers began to swirl through the village. The most startling came from Mrs. Peveril, the postmistress, who stopped Miss Marple outside the bakery the next morning, lowering her voice as if discussing a scandal. "You didn't hear it from me," Mrs. Peveril began, casting a furtive glance over her shoulder. "But Miss Vera was seen burning papers late last night, right near the bakery, burning them, like they were some kind of secret." The implications were clear. Vera, too, had her own hidden truths. In Miss Marple's experience, secrets were often the most dangerous kind of weapon, more potent than any poison, and capable of destroying lives just as effectively. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together. Each whisper, each secret, each glance told a part of the story. But the truth was still elusive, hidden beneath layers of carefully crafted facades. Miss Marple could sense it now. The truth was closer than ever, and she would uncover it in her own time, as she always did. The air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and lavender, the kind of fragrance that clung to the memory long after it had faded. Miss Marple stood at the threshold of Vera's cottage, later that afternoon, having come under the pretense of returning a forgotten glove. But there was no mistaking the tension in the air. As she stepped inside, the faint odor of charred paper mixed with the floral notes, an odd combination that made her pause. Vera's greeting was stiff, almost mechanical, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the glove. "I do hope you're resting," Miss Marple offered with quiet concern, her eyes scanning the room. "Such a dreadful business, all of it." Vera, her face a mask of control, nodded sharply. "I'm trying to keep busy." Her voice, though steady, lacked the conviction of someone who had found peace. Miss Marple's eyes shifted to the hearth, where the remnants of a fire still smoldered faintly, grey ashes clinging to the edges of the fireplace. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze lingering on the embers, "we burn the past to keep it from rising again." Vera's smile faltered, her eyes flickering for a moment with something like regret. "Some things," she replied quietly, "are best forgotten." Miss Marple inclined her head in agreement. "Indeed," she said, though the glint in her eyes suggested she was far from convinced that all was as it seemed. "Though letters do have a way of outlasting our intentions." Her words hung in the air, like a seed planted in fertile soil. As she left, the weight of that conversation pressed on her. Vera's attempt to erase the past had not gone unnoticed, and Miss Marple, with her finely tuned instincts, knew that secrets, especially those scorched by fire, were rarely as extinguished as they appeared. The next day, Mrs. Rudge, ever loyal to her late mistress's habits, led Miss Marple to the pantry, where Lavinia's belongings had been kept with a precision almost reverent. Mrs. Rudge's hands trembled as she lifted a tin from the shelf, frowning deeply. "This one's not the same brand we served," she said, her voice low. "Lady Grey, it says. But Lavinia preferred Dodgson." Miss Marple took the tin from her hands, noting the faint chemical tang that lingered beneath the bergamot scent. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Inspector Cray had the tea tested, and the results came back quickly. Trace amounts of cyanide too faint to be fatal, but unmistakably there. Mrs. Rudge's face tightened with confusion. "We didn't use this one," she insisted, the shock evident in her voice. "I've never even seen it until today. Found it at the back of the shelf, hidden away." Cray raised an eyebrow. "Could someone have placed it there recently?" Mrs. Rudge blinked, still processing the reality of the situation. "I suppose. But who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple's fingers lingered over the tin's smooth surface. The label was pristine, the seal recently broken. This wasn't a mere accident. It was a message, a deliberate attempt to mislead. The poison had been left intentionally, but not in a way that could ever lead back to the culprit. A clever misdirection, she thought. Someone wanted poison to be found, but not to be traced directly back to them. A decoy, perfectly placed to confuse and mislead. And Miss Marple, with her many years of experience, knew that such distractions always had one purpose: to keep the truth just out of reach. As the investigation deepened, a chance remark by Mrs. Rudge sparked another line of inquiry. Over an afternoon cup of tea, her words spilled out unexpectedly. "Miss Vera used to visit nearly every day, you know," Mrs. Rudge said, stirring her tea slowly, eyes distant. "But not since that unpleasantness." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Unpleasantness?" she asked, her voice mild but piercing. Mrs. Rudge hesitated, then sighed, lowering her voice. "Well, there was a man, Mr. Edmund's friend, I believe. Lavinia didn't like it, thought it improper. Vera, well, she got involved, you see, thought it was all a bit too much. And that's when the trouble started." Miss Marple's mind raced. A disgraced companion, a married man, scandal had always been a volatile mix in small villages. But what had really happened between Vera and this man? And why had Lavinia reacted so fiercely? Was he attached? Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but deliberate. Mrs. Rudge nodded. "Married. That's the trouble. Lavinia made quite a scene about it. Told Vera she'd ruin her name if she didn't stop. After that, Vera didn't come around much." Miss Marple's mind absorbed the details. A threat of scandal, a romantic entanglement that had been deemed improper, and the bitter aftertaste of a ruined reputation. These were potent motives, especially in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business. Even after all these years, the wounds of old scandals never truly healed. They festered, hidden behind a facade of civility, only to surface when least expected. The gossip that circulated through Nether Compton was thick with implications, each tale more colorful than the last. But one story in particular had caught Miss Marple's attention, a whisper that followed her as she walked down the lane to Mrs. Frobisher's shop for a jar of lemon curd. "You know, Mrs." Frobisher had leaned in, speaking in a hushed tone. "What they're saying about Beatrice Langley's time in India. The things she did there. Some people never forget." The words struck Miss Marple like a bolt of lightning. Secrets, especially ones buried far from home, had a way of creeping back when least expected. As the afternoon waned, and the clouds rolled in thick with the threat of a storm, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something critical was slipping just out of her grasp. She had witnessed the subtle tension in Vera's cottage earlier, a disquiet that only grew stronger the more she thought about it. There were whispers of secrets, long buried, resurfacing with the sharpness of a blade, threatening to cut through years of carefully constructed facades. The letters she'd discovered, the old and crinkled ones, contained more than mere memories. They were a warning of something unfinished, something that could no longer remain dormant. As she walked slowly back toward her cottage, she overheard a conversation between two figures who thought themselves alone. Beatrice Langley, the ever-composed and now slightly worn widow, and Dr. Howard Green, the respectable man whose perfectly polite demeanor hid a heart heavy with guilt. Their voices, low and edged with desperation, caught her attention. The words they exchanged told of a scandal, one that had festered for years, a scandal that involved a secret child, a child long concealed, denied, but never forgotten. It seemed Lavinia Fitton, with her love of gossip and her insatiable curiosity, had stumbled upon this secret, threatening to unravel it at the most inopportune moment. The faint tremor in Beatrice's voice, the coldness in Howard's reply, the unresolved bitterness hanging in the air between them. It was all too telling. Miss Marple understood now. It wasn't just the old letters or the strange tin of tea that had drawn her attention. It was the fact that someone, desperate to keep their secrets hidden, had been willing to kill to ensure that they remained buried. With the confession of an affair, a child left behind, and a threat of exposure, the pieces were beginning to fall into place, each revelation more damning than the last. The poisoning of Lavinia Fitton, once seen as a tragic accident, was now unfolding as something far more deliberate, a well-calculated act of vengeance that had been years in the making. The truth was within her reach, but it was buried beneath layers of deceit and fear. Miss Marple, ever patient, ever methodical, knew this was no ordinary case. The stakes were higher, the players more desperate, and the past more alive than ever before. Every word, every glance, every hushed conversation mattered now. There were few things more dangerous than a person with nothing left to lose, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that those with the most to hide would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, even if it meant murder. The puzzle pieces were no longer scattered randomly in Miss Marple's mind. They had begun to shift with quiet precision, forming a picture that was too intricate to ignore. She had always trusted her instinct, believing that even the smallest, most overlooked detail held the answers to mysteries as complex as the one before her. And now, as she sifted through the fragments of the case, it was Vera's calm and rehearsed grief that gnawed at her, soft, unassuming, but far too practiced. It had struck her at the time as nothing more than a woman consumed by the loss of a friend, a companion she had spent years serving. But now, Miss Marple's sharp mind began to unravel the performance that had so expertly masked the truth. Vera's grief wasn't genuine sorrow. It was a carefully staged act, one she had perfected over time. The key, she realized, lay in the spoon. At first, Miss Marple had assumed the moment at tea was just a flurry of nerves, a minor mishap caused by the uneven garden stones. The silver tray had tipped, the cups had rattled, and in the commotion one cup had spilled. It seemed like nothing more than a momentary lapse in order, nothing to stir suspicion. But that was before she had noticed Vera's precise movement, the deliberate way her hand reached for the spoon. It wasn't her own, but one from the tray. It wasn't just an innocent mix-up. No, it was far more calculated. Vera had taken a spoon from the side nearest Lavinia's usual spot, the one that had always been set aside for her. The timing was flawless, and as Vera muttered her apology with that soft and "oh dear," it was clear to Miss Marple that the moment was too choreographed to be accidental. In the hours that followed, Miss Marple couldn't shake the thought that Vera hadn't simply chosen the wrong spoon by mistake. It had been intentional, a measured action. If Lavinia had been poisoned, it was most certainly not through the tea itself but through the spoon, delicately coated with poison, a substance that would dissolve invisibly once stirred into the hot liquid. This explained the lack of residue in the teacup, the absence of a telltale scent in the teapot, the baffling contradictions of the evidence. It was a method so subtle, so precise, that even the most observant eye might miss it. And Vera, with her quiet demeanor, her love of detective novels, and her past as a companion who once read stories aloud to Lavinia, had the perfect knowledge to execute such a crime. She had known the weaknesses of her employer, understood the dynamics of their relationship, and most importantly, had spent years reading and absorbing the subtleties of mystery and deceit. But as the pieces fell into place, Miss Marple found herself troubled by the enormity of it all. Vera had not acted alone. Of that she was certain. Someone else had played a role, had set the stage for this meticulous act of betrayal. And then the memory of Lavinia's words returned, words spoken so carelessly, so flippantly. At the annual church bazaar, people are so unimaginative about murder, she had scoffed, lifting a well-worn copy of The Crimson Cordial from a stack of yellowed novels. It's always arsenic in the cake, or poison in the drink. No one ever suspects the teaspoon. At the time, Miss Marple had laughed along, dismissing the remark as nothing more than a casual musing. But now, as she recalled the words, they came rushing back with a cold chill. The way Lavinia had said it, so knowingly, so smugly, had all the hallmarks of a woman who understood exactly how murder could be concealed. She had planted that seed in Miss Marple's mind long before the murder had even been committed, and now it all made sense. Miss Marple felt a tightening in her chest, a gnawing sensation that there was more to this than just the obvious plot. Lavinia had been a master at manipulating those around her, holding their secrets in her tightly gloved hands, dangling them just out of reach. She had played a dangerous game with everyone she had encountered, and now, in death, those secrets had come back to haunt her. But who had she really betrayed? Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if Vera had truly been the one to execute the crime, or had Lavinia's own machinations somehow led her down this dark path. Was Vera the victim of Lavinia's games, manipulated into taking the final irrevocable step? The pieces fit too well. Miss Marple could see it now. The poisoned spoon, the subtlety of the murder, and the knowing smirk Lavinia had worn as she taunted others with her secrets. She had been playing a game that she never intended to lose, and it had cost her her life. The realization that Lavinia's cruelty had been her own undoing was almost too poetic. But Miss Marple wasn't finished yet. As she walked back toward the house, the questions still echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of her thoughts. Who had been the true mastermind? Had Lavinia's own secret been used against her by someone closer than she had ever realized? There were so many layers to peel back, so many threads to follow. But Miss Marple knew she was getting closer. The truth was always there, hiding in plain sight, and she had learned long ago to trust the smallest of details. It was time to uncover the final pieces, and bring the curtain down on this twisted tale. Miss Marple slowly placed her gardening shears down, her gloved hands still and steady, as her mind whirled with the tangled threads of the mystery that had grown tighter with every passing hour. Lavinia's carelessness in her choice of confidant had sealed her fate. She had not died for the sins she had committed, but for those she might have revealed in the whispers of the coming days. The clues were there, scattered like breadcrumbs on the path of deceit. It was time for Miss Marple to pay another visit to the one place where all secrets, no matter how carefully concealed, would eventually come to light: the cutlery drawer. The Fitton household, once full of the bustle of life, had already begun its slow, mournful transformation in the wake of death. The silence had settled in like a thick fog, and the paperwork, so often the forgotten burden of grief, had started its slow march forward. The solicitor had come, his visit brief but heavy with legalese, leaving the family's fate in limbo, while the will was still under review. In the meantime, the staff moved with quiet efficiency, packing away Lavinia's prized possessions into boxes, each piece marked with a label that seemed to carry with it the weight of finality. Miss Marple, with her tray of shortbread carefully prepared for Mrs. Rudge, walked through the quiet halls, her footsteps soft, almost as if to match the atmosphere of the house. The conversation about the special occasion silver was a small one, a soft inquiry designed to appear as nothing more than an innocent question. But the maid, sensing Miss Marple's need for something beyond mere pleasantries, led her to the pantry cupboard, where the velvet-lined case awaited. As the case was opened, the polished silver teaspoons gleamed with an almost unnatural perfection, their smooth handles reflecting the light as if they had been waiting for this moment. Miss Marple turned each one over slowly, carefully, her gloved fingers tracing the lines with meticulous precision. They all appeared identical at first glance, but her eyes narrowed as she reached the sixth spoon. There, along the ridge where the bowl met the handle, was a faint imperfection, something that felt wrong to her touch. It wasn't a defect, not in the traditional sense. No, this was something different. Miss Marple leaned in closer, her gaze sharp, her mind already moving ahead. There, just visible to the eye, was the faintest film, a thin, cloudy residue that resisted her fingernail when she traced it. A quick test in a bowl of warm water confirmed her suspicion. As the spoon sank beneath the surface, tiny bubbles began to form, rising to the surface with an almost imperceptible hiss, and with them, the unmistakable scent of bitter almonds, acrid and sharp cyanide. But it wasn't scattered. It wasn't poured. It was embedded, lacquered onto the surface, designed to release its deadly venom only when stirred into a hot drink, perfectly timed. Miss Marple allowed herself the briefest of smiles as she returned the spoon to its velvet case, closing it with a soft click. Now the truth was clear. This was no crime born of passion or haste. This was a calculated act. A story written not in ink but in malice, and Miss Marple knew exactly who had penned the final chapter. As she walked home through the winding lanes, the pieces of the puzzle clicked together with quiet precision. The brilliance of the method was in its subtlety. To poison the tea itself would have been too risky, too overt. But a single spoon, prepared in advance, slipped into the mix during the briefest moment of distraction. Now that was a method born of both cunning and patience. The tray spill that had initially seemed like nothing more than a moment of clumsiness was in fact part of the plan. Vera had orchestrated it. Of that Miss Marple was certain. Just enough chaos to obscure her movements, to give her the opportunity to switch the spoons without anyone noticing. The spill, the apology, the reset, it had all been a carefully constructed scene. Vera had known exactly which spoon Lavinia always used, the one that was paired with her favorite cup, and it had been that spoon she had tampered with. But when the spill occurred, Vera had acted with quick precision, dropping her own spoon, and then subtly swapping it for the poisoned one. It had been a delicate game of timing and subtlety, and once the poison was activated by the heat of the tea, there was no way to trace it. There was no violence, no confrontation, only a smile, a stir, and the cup of Darjeeling passed between them with polite civility. And just like that, Lavinia Fitton, unaware of the weapon nestled among her finest silver, had taken her last breath. Miss Marple turned towards her garden, the scent of rosemary rising on the evening breeze, the quiet of the village around her. But there was still one thing left to do. The last scene was waiting to unfold. She had summoned the suspects to the vicarage drawing room, a place where secrets would be laid bare. The invitations had been simple, polite, an afternoon gathering to remember the late Mrs. Fitton, tea and light refreshments offered in quiet remembrance. None of the guests knew what awaited them, but Miss Marple did. The truth would be revealed, and the final pieces of this complex puzzle would fall into place. The game was over. Miss Marple sat at the head of the room, the low hum of murmurs around her, but her gaze was fixed and unblinking, as if she could see through the facades of the people seated before her. The light from the afternoon sun, filtering through the drawn curtains, cast long shadows on the antique furniture, giving the room a timeless, eerie quality. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting. "It's curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple said softly, her voice a mere whisper among the crowd. "How we dismiss the small things. We overlook them because they seem insignificant. A stumble, a gesture, an object left in the wrong place." She let the silence hang heavily for a moment, her eyes glancing over the gathered faces. Edmund Fullerton, his hands restless and fingers twitching, looked away, his pallor deepening. Vera Calthorpe, ever poised, kept her gaze steady but cold. Dr. Green, ever the professional, wore the mask of indifference, though his eyes flickered just for a second. Beatrice Langley, her usual grace shattered by a veil of suspicion, clutched her teacup tightly, her knuckles whitening. Reverend Phelps, the ever-present observer, was more still than anyone, his lips tight, his brow furrowed, as if he knew the inevitable truth but didn't wish to speak it aloud. Miss Marple continued, the corners of her mouth curving just slightly into a knowing smile. Lavinia, poor dear, was a woman of many secrets, she said, her voice almost tender, as if speaking of a long-lost friend. But I do wonder, was she also a woman who loved puzzles? Or was it simply that the puzzle loved her? She allowed the room to digest the question, the air thickening with the unspoken. You see, Lavinia didn't die just from poison. No, she died from something far more intricate, far more deliberate, Miss Marple added, leaning forward slightly, a glint of intensity in her eyes. A soft clink of porcelain echoed as someone set down their teacup. Cyanide, Miss Marple said simply. The word hung in the air like an accusation. But not from the teacup, she added, her gaze flicking over to Dr. Green. No, not from the teacup. It wasn't in the cakes either. It wasn't even in Lavinia's tea. The key was much simpler than that. She paused for effect, the room falling into a heavy, charged silence. It was in the spoon. Her words dropped like a stone into the stillness. And for a moment, none of them could breathe. She studied the faces before her with cold precision. A silver-plated spoon. Nothing remarkable. But it was coated with a thin, nearly invisible layer of cyanide, carefully mixed with a lacquer to keep it undetectable. A slow poison, one that would only reveal itself when stirred into hot tea. She let the words settle, watching the growing tension in the room. It was subtle, a hidden weapon, disguised among the ordinary. She shifted her gaze towards Vera, whose pale face betrayed a flicker of unease. Vera, you were the one who always read Lavinia, her detective stories, weren't you? Miss Marple's voice was soft but unyielding. You would have known exactly how such a thing could be done. And more importantly, how it could be overlooked. Vera's grip on her teacup tightened. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes never leaving her. You see, it was the spill. The small accident that disrupted everything. A moment of chaos. But it was precisely the opportunity Vera needed. A distraction to cover the sleight of hand. To swap the spoons without anyone noticing. You dropped your own spoon, didn't you, Vera? But instead of reaching for your own, you grabbed the spoon meant for Lavinia's cup. Vera's lips parted, but Miss Marple silenced her with a single sharp look. I saw you, and it was in that moment, that one overlooked moment, that the truth became clear. You meant to kill Lavinia. The room was deathly quiet, each person frozen, every eye trained on Vera. Miss Marple's voice softened but carried an undeniable authority. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? But you underestimated one thing. The small details. The ones that no one thinks to notice. Except me. She allowed a thin, knowing smile to play on her lips. The smallest of details, often dismissed, are the very things I never forget. And that, my dear friends, is how we solve the mystery. Not by looking for the obvious, but by seeing the unnoticed. She sat back in her chair, her fingers gently curling around her teacup, her expression serene but full of quiet triumph. It was the spoon, my dear Vera, the spoon that sealed your fate. The room fell into a profound silence, as the weight of Miss Marple's words settled in the air, heavy with the scent of brewed tea. The others sat still, some with furrowed brows, others with pale faces, all trying to process the unfolding truth. It's always the smallest details that betray the largest secrets, Miss Marple continued, her voice a soft, unwavering melody that somehow carried the force of 1,000 revelations. She turned her gaze toward Vera, who now sat rigid, her lips tight, the color draining from her cheeks. You see, Lavinia, sharp as she was, had a way of knowing people. She observed habits, customs, the way we held our teacups, the way we stirred our tea. She could read people as if they were open books, and yet, despite her perceptiveness, she missed one crucial detail, the one detail that ultimately led to her demise. Vera shifted uneasily, but Miss Marple's eyes never wavered. You were too careful, Vera, too meticulous in your planning, too consumed by your need for secrecy. You thought you could play the game and escape unscathed. But in the end, it was the smallest slip, the spoon, that unraveled your entire plot. The other guests shifted, their discomfort growing, as they tried to piece together what had transpired. A silver-plated spoon, coated with a delicate layer of cyanide. Miss Marple continued, her words deliberate, each one a measured stroke in the painting of this grim picture. You knew the tea had to be just right, hot, soothing, and inviting. You knew Lavinia would always reach for her cup with the same precise movements, the same habitual motions that she had done countless times before. But what you didn't account for was the quiet observer, the one who noticed when you shifted the spoons, when you replaced her usual one with the deadly one, hidden under the guise of an accidental clink. The room seemed to constrict around Vera, her breath shallow as Miss Marple's words circled her like a tightening noose. Lavinia trusted you, Vera, Miss Marple said, her tone almost pitying. She welcomed you into her life, even after the fallings out, even when she knew you had been hiding secrets of your own. But you betrayed her, not just out of jealousy or anger, but out of fear. Fear of exposure, fear of losing everything. Vera's hand trembled as she reached for her teacup, but Miss Marple's next words stopped her in her tracks. You had a reason, didn't you? A reason rooted in something much deeper than mere greed. It was about power, control, and the deep shame you tried so desperately to bury. The affair, the letters, the things you thought would never resurface. Lavinia knew, Vera. She knew all along. The air in the room thickened, the tension palpable as the truth hung suspended in the silence. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice held a hard edge as she leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Vera's face. You thought you could silence her. You thought the past could remain locked away in that dusty chest of yours. But in reality, the past is always watching, waiting to spill its secrets when least expected. Vera's lips parted, her eyes darting toward Edmund, who sat in stunned disbelief. You knew the consequences of what you were doing, Miss Marple continued. The will, the threats Lavinia had made. But it wasn't just about inheritance. It was about a woman reclaiming her power after years of being underestimated, after years of being silenced. And when Lavinia revised that will, when she made her intentions clear, you saw your life slipping away. A cold chill spread through the room as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together. And so, Miss Marple said, almost gently, you did what you thought was necessary. You murdered her, using the very tools she trusted. But in doing so, you underestimated her one final time. She trusted you, yes, but she also knew how to leave a trail for those who knew how to look. Miss Marple paused, letting her words linger in the thickening silence, before adding, in the end, it wasn't the poison that exposed you. It was the smallest detail, the shift of a spoon. That was your mistake, Vera. You thought you could escape the consequences of your actions, but it was the details, the ones you never suspected anyone would notice, that gave you away. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room once more, a quiet intensity in her gaze, that made the air seem to thicken, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She took a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle over them, before speaking again, her voice low but razor-sharp, carrying with it the certainty of someone who had seen through the layers of deception with practiced ease. There was one moment, she began, her words as deliberate as the steps of a slow dancing waltz, a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, that in its simplicity revealed everything. She paused, her gaze unwavering from Vera, who sat motionless, her expression a mask of both fear and disbelief. Just before the tea was served, Miss Marple continued, her tone soft but piercing. You approached the tray, like the others, but there was something different in your movement. A hesitation, a pause, one that lasted longer than necessary. Your hand hovered near the drawer, the one where the spoons are kept. It was such a small thing, Vera. Barely a second. But I saw it. The room held its breath. Vera's hands, so tightly clenched on her lap, began to tremble slightly, betraying the calm she tried to project. Miss Marple's eyes flicked momentarily to the drawer, the very one that had once concealed the tool of death, and then back to Vera. You glanced into the drawer, she continued, her voice quiet, but laden with understanding, and then you turned away. But there was no accident in what happened next. When the tray wobbled, and the spoon fell from your hand, It wasn't a mistake. It was calculated, deliberate. The silence stretched, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. That spoon, Miss Marple said, her gaze never leaving Vera's, wasn't just any spoon. It was the one you'd carefully chosen, the one you had prepared in advance, knowing full well what it would carry. Vera's breath hitched, her eyes darting to the others in the room, as if searching for someone to absolve her. But no one moved. The walls seemed to close in, pressing in on her, tightening like a vice. You knew Lavenia's habits better than anyone, didn't you? Miss Marple's voice softened, almost regretful now, as if speaking to a wayward child. You knew exactly where she would sit, the cup she would choose, the way she always took her tea. You had all of that knowledge, and you used it to plan a murder, a crime so perfectly constructed that you thought it would go unnoticed. She shook her head, a faint sigh escaping her lips. But you see, Vera, you made one mistake. You underestimated me. You thought that an old woman in the corner of a garden would be too distracted by her knitting to notice a single glance. But I did notice. I saw it. The way your eyes flickered toward the drawer, the way your hands moved with practiced precision. In St. Mary Mead, murder doesn't shout. It doesn't scream. It doesn't even whisper. It starts with a look, a glance, and from that moment, I knew. Vera's face drained of color. Her lips parted as if she wanted to protest, but the words were trapped behind the weight of her guilt. Her hands, so tightly clasped before, were now wringing themselves, twisting in an unconscious reflection of the turmoil rising within her. Miss Marple continued, her voice taking on a more sympathetic tone, though it was unwavering in its resolve. You didn't mean for it to go this far, did you? She asked softly, almost kindly. You only wanted to frighten her, make her feel vulnerable, to remind her that she wasn't invincible. But Vera, poison isn't a warning. It isn't a message. It's an end, a finality. The room seemed to darken as Vera's voice broke, a raw edge to her words. She said she would ruin me, she whispered, her eyes darting to the others, seeking something, anything that could offer a way out of the suffocating truth. She told me she would expose me for what I was, that I was nothing, a parasite living off her charity, that I would never belong anywhere. She always kept her promises. You see, the bitterness in her voice was palpable, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the very air in the room had been poisoned by the venom in her words. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. You believed her, she said gently, but with a quiet certainty. You believed her promises of power and status, and you thought you had no other choice but to act. But you were wrong, Vera. There was always a choice. Inspector Cray, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of the law. You thought you could control it, he said, his words slow but deliberate. You thought you could escape the consequences. But you can't. Not when the truth is already written in the movements of your hands. His gaze shifted to Miss Marple, admiration barely veiled by his professional demeanor. You saw it all, didn't you? Before anyone else. Before the autopsy. Before the toxicology reports. You knew the moment you saw her hands hover. The moment she gave herself away. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her eyes twinkling with the faintest hint of satisfaction. I saw it in her hands. Yes, she replied softly. The way they hovered, not trembling, not shaking with nerves, but rehearsed, controlled. A person who had practiced this moment for far longer than they realized. She smiled faintly, the corners of her lips lifting with the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. In my experience, Inspector, a mystery always begins at the edges. It's the little things that unravel the greatest crimes. She glanced down at the half-empty teacups, their delicate china now bearing witness to something far darker than a simple afternoon gathering. And in this case, Vera stirred one cup too many, and it was that one mistake that sealed her fate. As Vera was led away, her step slow and heavy, Miss Marple remained seated, watching with quiet composure. The drawing room seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating, leaving only the faintest echo of what had transpired. The others departed in subdued silence, their presence still lingering in the air like a faint fragrance. Inspector Cray's words hung in the room like a final chord, the truth having been spoken, yet still reverberating in the stillness of the room. "You knew, didn't you?" he had said. And Miss Marple, with the most unassuming smile, had replied, "Oh, I don't solve murders, dear. I just notice what others forget." The room returned to its quiet stillness, the case now closed, but the layers of human frailty, fear, desperation, and the hunger for control remained. And in the end, that Miss Marple knew, was the true mystery. The morning fog hung heavily over Nether Compton, casting a quiet veil over the garden as Edmund Fullerton stood by the gate of Miss Marple's cottage, his suitcase beside him, a faint trace of confusion still evident on his face. The previous day's ordeal had left him unscathed in the eyes of the law, thanks to Miss Marple's quiet intervention with Inspector Cray. His movements had been accounted for, his shock genuine, but a sense of finality had settled over him. The revised will, so carefully crafted by Lavinia, had reduced his inheritance to a meager annuity, a sum sufficient to live, but hardly the fortune he had once imagined would be his. Lavinia had, in her own way, passed her judgment, not through the sharpness of the law, but through something more insidious, a shift in the very fabric of their relationship. Her change of heart had come too late to formally disinherit him, yet not soon enough to forgive him. Edmund paused before Miss Marple's gate, his hand lifting to remove his hat with a tight, pained smile. "You were right about everything," he muttered, his voice heavy with the weight of resignation. Miss Marple, standing with her usual grace and calm, met his gaze with a quiet understanding. "No, Mr. Fullerton," she replied, her voice gentle yet firm. "Only about human nature." His expression faltered slightly, his eyes clouded with regret. Do you think I could have stopped her?" he asked, his voice breaking on the last word. Miss Marple's gaze softened, her sharp mind turning the question over like an ancient puzzle, before she finally spoke, her words slow but resolute. "Perhaps, but guilt is not always about action. Sometimes it's about silence." Edmund nodded slowly, the full weight of his past choices settling around him like a shroud. The shame, Miss Marple knew, would be harder to bear than any legal sentence could have been. As he turned and walked away, the gravel crunching beneath his feet, she watched him go, not unkindly, but with the quiet understanding that some forms of punishment could never be meted out by the law. Some were born in the stillness of whispered words, in stolen glances, in what remained unsaid over the teacups. Meanwhile, Beatrice Langley and Dr. Green had resumed their usual routines, but something subtle had shifted between them. The unspeakable conversation they'd shared, the one that bound them both to a past drenched in scandal and regret, remained locked away, sealed in the silence between them. The scandal in India, the child, the shame that had loomed over them both like a shadow, never surfaced again. But Miss Marple, of course, noticed the quiet change, the faint shift in their gestures, the softened tone of their voices whenever they spoke. It wasn't romance. No. It was an alliance of survival, a quiet understanding forged in the depths of shared secrets and mutual fear. It wasn't justice, strictly speaking, but sometimes, Miss Marple mused, the preservation of dignity required a certain discretion. Not all truths, after all, needed to be spoken aloud, especially when silence could offer protection. Mrs. Rudge, having seen more than her share of tea spills and houseguests' drama, handed in her notice just 3 days later, her smile weary but resigned. "I've had enough of teacups and trays," she said, with a sigh, her hands already packed with the remnants of her time in Miss Marple's service. She wasn't dismissed, nor disgraced. Lavinia's solicitor had ensured she would receive a modest pension for her years of loyalty. The village saw her off with the usual polite ceremony, the neighbors offering thanks with sponge cake, and the quiet murmurs of a life concluded. "I think I'll visit my niece in Torquay," Mrs. Rudge remarked as the carriage door shut behind her, her eyes sparkling at the thought of sea air and the relief of no more silver to polish. Miss Marple walked her to the carriage, placing a small bouquet of roses into her hands. "You were loyal," Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost imperceptible in its warmth. "And kind. That counts for something in the end." Mrs. Rudge dabbed her eyes with the corner of her shawl. "It wasn't always easy, miss. But I did my best," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And that," Miss Marple said, her words gentle but firm, "is more than most can claim." As the carriage pulled away, another chapter in Nether Compton quietly closed. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her parlor window, the rhythmic ticking of her knitting needles the only sound in the room as Florence dusted the sideboard. The room was serene, the events of the past days settling into the past like dust settling on an old book. And yet, as always, Miss Marple's mind worked, turning over every detail, every gesture, every unsaid word. For in the quiet corners of human nature, she knew, lay the true mysteries, ones far more intricate than any crime could ever be. "Such a curious thing," Florence remarked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "To think it was Vera. So polite, so soft-spoken." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze distant. "Yes, Florence. It's always the quiet ones." Her tone was steady, but beneath it lay a subtle conviction. She didn't raise a voice when the will was read, just sat there, sipping her tea, as though nothing had happened. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, almost wistful. "Poisoners rarely shout," she added, her voice soft, almost reflective. "They don't bludgeon or break down doors. They stir, Florence." Florence blinked, not quite understanding. "Stir," she repeated, her brow furrowing. Miss Marple's eyes remained on the horizon, a faraway look in them, as if she were seeing something no one else could. "Yes," she murmured. "They stir the sugar bowl, stir the tea. They stir the air around them ever so gently, until one day, someone simply stops breathing." Florence fell silent, her hands stilling in mid-air, as she absorbed Miss Marple's words. The silence that followed was not one of discomfort, but of respectful understanding. Some dangers, Miss Marple knew, arrived with the force of thunder, loud, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. Others crept in, quieter, more insidious, and far more difficult to detect. The seasons shifted, and with them, a subtle calm settled over St. Mary Mead. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, the roses bursting into bloom, their petals fuller than ever before, and the garden buzzed with the gentle hum of new life. Yet, amidst this quiet renewal, Miss Marple continued her routine, trimming hedges, observing, and knitting. The mystery of Vera Calthorpe, the poisoned spoon, and the quiet destruction she had wrought, seemed like a distant memory. Mysteries, once solved, were set aside like completed puzzles, their pieces locked away in the recesses of the mind. But every now and then, as Miss Marple sipped her tea, or untangled a knot in her wool, she would glance at the teaspoon resting in her cup, and smile, faintly, but knowingly. She knew that in the world of human nature, riddles were never truly solved. They merely waited to be understood, and it was always the quietest corners of life, where the most dangerous secrets festered, hidden in whispered conversations, stolen glances, and the delicate clink of silver spoons in teacups. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely served through grand gestures. In this case, the truth had not been unearthed by fingerprints or confessions, but through one woman's quiet certainty that human nature, when observed closely enough, always reveals its secrets. Beneath every polite smile, after all, might lie a storm of fear, envy, or desperation. Vera didn't kill merely for fortune. No, her motives were deeper. She sought control, dignity, and power, things she had always lacked, and now in her twisted mind, believed she deserved. Yet, it was this very need for control, Miss Marple mused, that had led to her downfall. For in the end, the deadliest crimes are often the most delicate, those that leave no trace, but a subtle shift in the air, a shift that only the keenest eyes can detect. But there remained one question. one that lingered like a shadow in Miss Marple's mind. What if the tray hadn't spilled? What if the poison had found its way into someone else's cup? Would Vera have stopped short of murder? Or would she have allowed an innocent to die, in order to protect her secret? Miss Marple's mind continued to turn over this question, always seeking the answer that would fit the pieces together. And as for you, dear listener, Miss Marple would love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Vera ever truly intended to stop short of murder? Or was her fate sealed the moment she opened that cutlery drawer? Let me know your theories, for I am genuinely curious to read them. If you enjoyed this mystery, I invite you to subscribe for more tales just like it. Stories brimming with suspense, subtle clues, and the classic twists that Miss Marple has made famous. And if you know someone who enjoys clever plots and cozy crime tales, share this story with them. It might just be the clue they didn't even realize they were missing. Until next time, keep your eyes open, for even in the gentlest of tea parties, there may lie a dark secret, hidden just beneath the lace.